Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sports Production in a Changed World, a TV News Check Working Lunch webinar. We are very pleased to have a distinguished group of speakers today, including our moderator, Glenn Dixon, veteran technology writer and contributing editor to TV News Check. Glenn, please go ahead and begin when you're ready.
Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon. Welcome to How Will Sports Production Look in a Post-COVID World? I'm Glenn Dixon. Probably no segment of the broadcast industry was impacted more by the COVID-19 pandemic than sports production, as all major professional and collegiate sports in the US shut down a year ago. It's basically about a year ago, almost to the day, pretty close. And other major events like the Tokyo Olympics and Wimbledon were postponed or canceled altogether. When sports production finally resumed last summer, it came with a long list of social distancing rules and restrictions that broadcasters had to follow. Network field operations and mobile truck and technology vendors have overcome these challenges by employing new remote production techniques and exploiting the power of IP connectivity. And in some cases, they've created efficiencies that will last well beyond the pandemic. Today, we'll discuss the playing field for TV sports going forward with a panel of experts. Joining me are Judy Boyd, SVP of Production for Fox Sports Media Group, Greg Copa, VP of Sports Technology for CBS Sports, Pat Sullivan, President and owner of Game Creek Video, Remo Ziegler, SVP of Product Management for VizRT, and Jerry Gepner, COO of CP Communications. For the audience, we'd like to make this experience as interactive as possible. There'll be some poll questions that'll be popping up on your screen that we'd like you to weigh in on. And please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists, which we'll address towards the end. And if you're having any technical issues, you can use the chat function to reach out to Kathy, who is helping manage the event. Let's start with our broadcasters. Judy, when you look at Fox Sports productions in 2021, what percentage of staff do you have on site now compared to back in 2019 before COVID-19 hit? And what are some of the new production workflows you've adopted over the last year?
Thanks, Glenn. I would say the number of staff is depending on the size of production, but on average, probably 50-50 based on either out of their home or in a remote scenario versus on site. But with the pandemic, it probably just accelerated the level of remote productions, doing it from what we call production anywhere or an at-home production versus all of us being on site. It accelerated that process, right? And it forced us to rethink and adapt to the COVID world of what we were doing today. And I think it's something that will continue to grow in that sector and make us more efficient in many ways. And, in some ways it forced us to rethink how we do things to make it better and quicker and more efficient. And, as you alluded to before, those practices will actually probably continue after we get back to sort of a normal world that we are in, that we hope to strive to get to within the next few years.
And just can you give me a little more detail about what Fox has done at your broadcast center in LA and other places to make this all work with fewer people actually out in the field and then other people working from home?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we had already started down that road, and obviously, the pandemic forced us to accelerate that. Our college and our baseball productions definitely started moving into an at-home production, which is, our control rooms based here in Los Angeles or in Charlotte, and really we're just feeding cameras back and doing everything from a home base. And then we also built a remote facility that housed our EBS and our graphics, both, Viz and our score box to, support remote productions on site, whether it be NFL or college football or baseball. So definitely forced us to build that remote site, that's a remote facility here in Los Angeles, but in some ways it's a hub, and it's an amazing thing, or was amazing for at least me to see, during the fall when on a Saturday or Sunday we had EVS and Viz and Scorebox coming and supporting, games in Columbus, Ohio, or Norman, Oklahoma, and then on a Sunday supporting, at various NFL sites, whether it's, all over the country. And I don't know if 5 or 10 years ago we ever thought that was possible. I'm sure somebody thought it was possible, but to be able to see it and to see it, 3 or 4 or 5 different game sites all coming from one hub in Los Angeles is an amazing thing to see.
Well, thanks. Greg, you deal a lot with the in-studio shows as part of CBS's sports coverage. What's been the impact for you of COVID-19 on the in-the-building staffing for CBS Sports, and what new workflows are you using as a result?
Thanks, Glenn. So just about a year to the day, in fact, we were asked to leave the building.
Yeah.
And that forced us, that began the conversation. And so what our target was 50%. We were asked to remote or just remove 50% of the working staff on a given, say, NFL or college football day. And we actually were able to meet that. And I think in some places we actually did better. And of course, the way we did that, it was we remoted a good deal of the operations. We took advantage of some very good technology. For example, WebRTC to give us low latency views of the productions that were going on in the broadcast center. So the conversations were around, who was essential, who had to be in the building. We looked closely at, of course, social distancing within control rooms, making sure that we adhered to the guidelines that were put in front of us by our health and safety folks. So we were pretty successful at it, and I think that the biggest compliment was that when ultimately the product that we put on the air didn't suffer all that much, if at all. So we did pretty well, and that was both for sports and Sports Network, which is Sports Network basically is on the air almost every day of the week out of a live or post-produced show, and they too had the same requirement to reduce their staff by about 50% on site.
And can you follow up? Can you talk about how you prioritize production and technical staff, and in terms of who's in the building and who's at home, and maybe in some cases where there's less people handling a certain function?
So the interesting thing is the technical staff was basically back in the building in a reduced way, almost within a week, because they were responsible for the on-air systems, and that relates mostly to Sports Network. Once we hit golf, we had further needs to have technical staff on site. With respect to production, that was mostly left to them, and they prioritized on-site and the remote personnel based on who we could provide or how we could provide the functionality of that production staff at a remote location, for example, at their homes. So an AD, for example, might be able, if we were to give them a low latency flow and they had VPN connectivity into the broadcast center, could essentially do their function at home. Loggers, you'd be amazed at the logging role that goes on an NFL Sunday. You could have up to 6 or 7 loggers logging games. Well, we were able to remotely put that operation at home with a simple $100 USB RF connected to a PC that an operator was able to, or a logger was able to remote into. So it was, the key elements are the people that sit in the control room. Obviously, the TD, the A1, graphics operators, and producers. They would actually be in the control room. So there was a priority that was put in place for those people. Essential personnel is essentially how it worked out.
Okay, thanks. And, and Judy, I just wanted to ask you too, how did Fox prioritize, staffers out in the field for production, particularly, support staff for talent, commentators, et cetera?
Yeah, just depending on the production and, in college football, obviously we prioritize based on COVID, and the world of, booths and college stadiums are not exactly the most luxurious, if those of you who've been in those college booths. So we had to prioritize with our talent, and a lot of that with prioritizing talent and with production, everyone had to prioritize what is essential and what is something that we could do remotely. And our talent in college had to have their, whether it's their spotter or stats person, do it from home or do it from another booth to assist them because of COVID, right? And the social distancing rules that we had to abide by. But look, everyone understood the world we were living in, and it wasn't something that was ever a question of it was a question of how we were doing it, but not necessarily, why or, any pushback in that sense. So, as Greg alluded to, we set people up with, low latency feeds, and they were able to provide statistical support for our talent, via monitors and being able to do that. And it's testament to all our talent. Everyone adapted. Everyone understood that this is the world we have to live by. And, don't think that our broadcasts were hurt by it at all. So in that sense, we did that. And with production, we did the same thing. You prioritize who has to be on site versus who can do it from either Los Angeles or from their home. We had tape producers sitting with our EBS in Los Angeles, but producer and director on site. Some of our graphics producers were sitting in Los Angeles, some were on site. It's just, because of social distancing, we had to keep the people on site to a minimum, and we just figured out how to do it efficiently.
Okay, thanks. Remo, from your perspective as a technology vendor, how has the pandemic shifted your product development, and what do you see as the long-term impacts amongst your sports production customers?
Yeah, I think one of I would almost say like the lucky things that we had from before is, like Judy mentioned at the beginning, is that in sports, the remote production is something that was already starting to happen before, was already put in place at some places. Of course, not to that extent that the shutdown afterwards completely blocked everything and it was kind of reducing number of people. But I think from the technology side, we already started to develop in this direction. I think in the first and foremost part where like the lockdown was most severe, we wanted to help our clients and customers to actually stay on air and produce things even from home, which already added to the complexity of just the remote production workflow, but actually people had to do stuff directly from their home. So that was kind of the first part. And then once it started to pick up, the sports was played again. We had, for instance, La Liga reach out to us to sort of decorate the stands with virtual spectators or virtual stands to get a better experience of when you watch the game afterwards. That's of course kind of a debate if this is better or not. So they kind of showed both without stands and with stands, but that basically came up, and then pretty much 3 weeks later, we had technology in place to do everything remotely out of Barcelona for all the games for the first division and the second division. So that was put in place quite quickly. We had no access to the stadiums. So I think there it was very good that the image-based technology, which doesn't necessarily require anything in the stadium, actually paid off quite well. And then as we moved closer to summer, NBA basically picked up as well with the NBA bubbles, and like the lack of people in sports is of course has a huge impact on the revenue as well for all the sports leagues and federations. which try to different ways to compensate at least parts for it. And the acceleration of the interest in virtual ads was also something that kind of boosted that. And it was nice to put just in combination where with the declaration of the past. So we basically were able to put up something quite quickly together with our partners. And I think one thing which was very particular in the last year, and I think is still going on, there is a lot together, a lot of creativity coming up, people wanting to help each other out, because the goal is basically to produce something. And then the same thing with talk shows. You have all of a sudden nobody can come into the studio. You want to bring them in, and I think to bring them in over kind of Zoom calls, Teams, like we do now, right? To basically produce like a full show with people coming in from remote. That was key. And I think one part that got accelerated quite a bit as well is NDI, which we use, and of course with our merger together with New Tech. That's something where we're very close to, and we are pushing that technology forward, because it just makes it very, very easy to basically plug in all kinds of sources and make it part of your production suite. So you want to have all of a sudden cameras from people at home being the input of your switcher, that you can just basically start and produce something. And then one thing that we also saw is kind of the need for flexibility. I mean, the flexibility in the sense of just bringing up a solution, but then from a vendor's perspective, also in the commercial model. Because we were quite based on perpetual model, but if you need to change your solution once like this, and once you need to change it back or then something else again, I think you need flexibility. And we switched basically our entire portfolio to subscription, or added subscription for that. I think that's something that happened all basically last year. And a lot of these things are to stay. I think sort of the flexibility and sort of also the reducing of cost of having people traveling around opens up the way to kind of also put it into virtualized workflows, because there it's easier also just with the hardware where we run everything on. So I think sort of looking forward and kind of the long-term impact is certainly that we have way more virtualized workflows in the cloud. We have brought out like a live production cloud solution where you have everything completely produced in the cloud, including the graphics. And that's one thing. And the other thing is the kind of the consumption habits, because I think the consumption habits are changing quite drastically. I mean, have been already from linear to more OTT and more digital. So the content that has to be produced is just becoming more and more. It has to be produced more efficiently. So automation is certainly one important part there, and sort of producing of more feeds, which can be more targeted to the audience, which you can monetize in different ways. So I think there is quite some exciting times in front of us. I think as soon as we have this hindering of the COVID a little bit out of the world, we will have all the kind of the nice parts of the innovation and moving forward and creating new things, and sort of don't have the hindering of coming together. And for that, it's also one piece where we want to, because we have this distributed production workflows, we really want to focus on having sort of video over WAN working completely, so that you can have a camera somewhere, you just bring it into the cloud, and it's almost like you have it just next to it. So I think that will definitely have an impact long term, and that's also one thing that we want to focus on.
Yeah, thanks. Pat, Remo talked about some of the changes in their business model and, going to subscriptions. Probably there's no part of this whole chain that had more of a change than the truck guys like yourself. Can you talk about, how the physical use of trucks has changed at the venues, and then, how you've adapted Game Creek's business?
Well, Game Creek is really our customer base is made up of two groups: the large networks, ESPN, Fox, CBS, NBC, and those folks, and then our regional sports customers like Madison Square Garden Network and Yes, and so on. The change in our business model was quite different between those two groups. In the national group, Fox actually started the year before 2019 with the system that Judy referenced, which had all their EVS operators from NASCAR operating out of LA. And so they were well positioned to do this when everything hit the fan. And then NBC for NASCAR, they decided to take a little bit different tack where they kept the trucks parked in Charlotte where their production teams predominantly lived. And we would have a remote truck that would go to the various tracks around the country and provide cameras and audio and things like that. But the shows were all being produced out of Charlotte. CBS asked us to come up with a system so that the sports network that Greg referenced could produce college football games from a spot in New Jersey and using the trucks and a system that we call GCV Anywhere. And that was very effective for allowing CBS not to have to travel a pretty large contingent to go do a college football game. On the regional side, it changed a lot because basically COVID became initially it was a safety matter, and it ended up where you would often have one or two trucks on site, sometimes three, and sometimes if you had a French Canadian presence and an English Canadian, sometimes you'd have as many as 5 trucks at a NHL game, and that all stopped. That stopped last year, and it became a world feed, and that continues this year with the NHL and NBA, and at least for part of the season, it looks like MLB is going to be the same situation. So that's a big impact on our industry. That's a collectively with our counterparts. We estimate that that's a $40 million loss for our industry. So, and I think there's a bigger long-term impact, which is that you have basically half of the talent pool of technicians, camera operators, EVS operators, and people like that don't have jobs because half the inventory for regional sports has been cut. So they're starting to look in other ways, and I think the long-term impact on that is going to be that we're going to have a real labor shortage down the road. We were facing that a little bit anyway because that was sort of an aging group, and I can say that because I'm aging. So I think that that's going to be a long-term impact of this as well. But I do not believe that we're going to go back to where we were in 2019, where particularly on the regional side, that you'd have 2, 3, 4 trucks in producing games.
And Pat, just a follow up. I've heard people suggest that because you can produce sports a lot differently, and there's a lot of things you can do over the public internet these days. I believe that was part of the technology behind that GCV Anywhere system you mentioned. That you have the ability to do more lower tier niche sports than that didn't make their way onto TV before, and obviously you have OTT as a distribution platform for them. But do you see that that new sports start getting covered and that creates jobs for those people you were talking about who are out of work, or is that a reach? Is there a growth? Because I think what Remo mentioned before, that there is sort of this emphasis with the OTT world on more and more and more, personalized feed, more personalized content, maybe stuff that's not broadly popular. Logically, you could assume that maybe there's a need for more coverages of different type, but you're in the business. Is that plausible in the next decade that, there's a lot more sports being covered?
Well, there's a lot more sports being covered right now than there was even 2 or 3, 4, 5 years ago. I mean, basically, you have all of these college conferences that have agreements with the networks that require the networks to produce what we refer to as Olympic sports. So things like volleyball and soccer and things that normally would not be produced, but they are being produced now, and they're being streamed, or and it may be a very small audience, but it still has to be produced. So the answer to your question is yes, some of those jobs will be filled, but I think the long term, and I'm sure Remo would echo this. The long term is that a lot of those things will be supported by cameras that are being run by artificial intelligence or 8K cameras where you can actually just come in on certain things that are of interest to a producer or director. So I think basically I think what COVID did was I've heard the term, it took us from sort of thinking about all this stuff to really accelerating it so that it's actually a reality now. And it's, if you're not really prepared to deal with those things and to actually help facilitate them, then you're going to be left behind.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. And Judy, I would like to talk to you more about that world feed notion and how that impacts your coverage and how you see that going forward. But I want to give Jerry a chance to talk and weigh in. Jerry likes to talk. I know Jerry from way back. But can you talk a little bit about what CP Communications has been doing through the pandemic, and what's been new that's created out of that?
Thanks. I appreciate that. And yes, I do like to talk, Glenn. But we had been working on a couple of different things sort of prior to the pandemic, sort of like everybody else had. Judy and Greg both pointed out that prior to the pandemic, they had already been working on ways to reduce the number of people in the field, to some extent reduce the amount of equipment needed in the field. And as Pat just pointed out, this whole situation accelerated things. My guess is by 3 to 5 years, it pulled things forward by as much as 36 to 60 months. And when we started talking to our clients, both Judy and Greg represent two of them, what we started hearing was the points that they made, that they were looking for things to keep the quality high, had to be simple, and had to be highly reliable in order for them to keep the content available when they needed it, and to keep expanding. In Greg's case, they have CBSSN in addition to into the big over-the-air network. What we did was we created a solution for the at-home announcer. Most of what we do in the field on a per event basis, we're working on other solutions to remote the control of those things. But the big thing that we heard from people was our announcers can't travel, or if they can, they can't travel very much. And if thinking back, several states had quarantine restrictions. So even if they wanted to travel, they weren't going to be allowed to leave the hotel room for a period of time after they went from one state to another. So we created a system we called CamStream, which was an amalgamation of several technologies that we've been working with for the past couple of years. The camera was 4K PTZ camera, Sony or Panasonic, really didn't matter. I will tell you, interestingly enough, in the early days of the pandemic, getting those cameras was almost impossible because the medical community had snapped up virtually the entire output of both companies' factories around the world. But we were able to secure them. Combining that with a bonded encoder that you relied on both Ethernet and cellular, 8 cellular connections at a time, to give you really high reliability. You mentioned the public internet as being highly leveraged in a lot of solutions. That's great until it isn't. We all know that it can be wonderful at 2 in the morning and not so good at noontime. So having an encoder that was able to bond cellular with Wi-Fi, with Ethernet, gave us the highest probability of success of getting an HD signal home. And we created a remote control audio interface on top of that allowed a master control to control audio levels, turn on things like phantom power, and use the traditional broadcast tools. This also had return video It had IFB, right? And recently we've added DMX control, NDI, SRT coding, and WebRTC for the return video, as Greg had mentioned, very low latency for return. We put this in a very simple box that has one button on it. One of CBS's announcers, who will remain anonymous, told us after it took him a total of 7 minutes to set it up. He said, "My God, this is so simple, a wide receiver could do it." And
Make my guess as who that might be.
I'm not going there. But we deployed dozens of these that provided high quality video, remote control of the camera, because not everybody knows how to frame a camera properly, the ability to use traditional high quality broadcast audio, and provide return video, prompter, that sort of thing, in a package that can ship via FedEx and get there the next day. Pretty rugged. And that sort of coalesced a lot of the technologies we had been working with and working on over the past 24 months. And it seemed to solve one of the big problems. And Judy mentioned earlier in her first answer that she doesn't see a lot of these changes disappearing when the disease is knocked down and the pandemic, a lot of the restrictions are lifted, nor do we. We see a lot of these workflow changes staying in place. That the idea of being able to have remote contributors to an event, whether it's a game analyst, play-by-play, or just an occasional contributor, dropping in, utilizing these type of technologies and these type of tools. I think that's something that the producers and the networks are going to, all the networks are going to look at and say, this is a valuable thing. It adds value to the content. And that sort of thing is going to stay in place. At the same time, and I touched on at the beginning, we are working on and will be releasing shortly a complete remote control suite of tools that will allow us to have remote control, or our clients to have remote control of all of our traditional RF and communications products, so that when we ship a rack to an event, it is not going to take a person with it, or won't take nearly as many people in the case of really complex jobs. So what we're looking at is sort of, quality, simplicity, reliability, and how do we solve those problems for our clients.
Thanks. I think Jerry explained, the basic premise pretty well, but Greg, can you give us a little more color on how CBS use those cam stream systems and maybe more important, how you see using them going forward?
Sure. I mean, Jerry made the point that, the travel restrictions and the quarantine restrictions made it virtually impossible for talent to be on site. Not only that, from a health and safety point of view, there were issues with distancing within the studio. How do you do that? So by deploying the cam streams at I don't know, half a dozen and a half talent locations, what we were able to do is have a single or one or two people on set in the studio, and have these basically live sessions with remote talent via these cam stream systems. And the Sports Network, for Sports Network, we produce a good deal of studio shows that air daily almost through the course of the NFL season and basketball. And so keeping those shows alive, if you will, depended heavily on being able to have remote talent contribute. And to Jerry's credit, I mean, these systems were very simple to deploy and very robust. You take for granted the fact that internet is available everywhere. Well, it's not. We actually had one talent who could not get an internet service into their home. There was just none available. And so we relied upon the bonded cellular for that location. And that, it wasn't always perfect. I mean, there were times when it would, and expectedly so, you would see a blocking error or something. But for the most part, it worked quite well. And it gave us all of the requirements: IFB, return video, the things that are important when you're doing this type of thing remotely.
Thanks. I was going to just take a break in my line of questions to ask a question from an audience member, because somebody mentioned the question was, maybe it already got answered, but I want to raise it again. It was somebody who is a graphics operator who's looking at the prospect of working from home remotely going forward a lot more because of the changes we've all been discussing. And they wanted to know, from a home broadband setup, what should they be shooting for? Is there anything they should do? Is there a certain quality level, up, down, that you guys at the networks, see as a benchmark?
Sure. I mean, we for all of the remote talent, the homes, we had installed dedicated bandwidth, a business class service, and we required that, of course, those systems be hardwired to that internet. We didn't rely upon Wi-Fi because it's just not reliable enough. But largely we did that because, particularly with the pandemic, people were at home, kids were at home streaming Netflix in the middle of the day, and that had an impact on on a home user's internet. So we do recommend, or I would recommend, that if someone were going to be working from home, particularly on air operations, that they have a dedicated bandwidth into the home for that purpose.
Okay, thanks. Pat, anything that you guys did in particular when you're backhauling some video over to the internet for some of these, regional productions?
Well, we were very fortunate in that most of the venues that we went to had some sufficient bandwidth during the college football season and during the college basketball season. Of course, the pro venues have plenty of bandwidth, so that's not really an issue. But you did occasionally run into certain universities where they would allocate a certain level of bandwidth to you that was not really sufficient, and we'd end up having issues, and we'd have to go back to them and get it resolved. So, but by and large, I would say that the that the bandwidth that we were dealing with was sufficient for us to do, to accomplish the mission that we were asked to accomplish, whether it was from CBS or ESPN or NBC or anybody else.
Okay, thanks. It's sunny and I don't know, 70 degrees here in New Jersey. It definitely feels like baseball weather. And Judy, when you look ahead to MLB starting in 3 weeks, we've heard that there's going to be some fans in the stands, which is obviously great news and a little step towards normalcy. What does it look like for you from an access point of view? Has that side of it improved compared to the MLB games you did last year?
I think in certain aspects it has improved. Obviously, we have different levels of access depending on the level of game we have. For games on our cable side with FS1, when we are one of 3 broadcasters, right, the home and away, and then us, and ESPN is in that boat at some points as well. Baseball has asked us to sort of step back and take a world feed, which we're fine with, and we understand that scenario and we understand why, because obviously protecting the product and protecting the players and protecting the amount of people in a stadium, even with fans, is still, TV people still have a little bit more access than the average fan, right? So they want to be able to protect their product as best they can, and we completely respect that. So the world feed scenario is what we're doing for our cable side, which we are 100% fine with, and we understand that. And so that's the same production that we did last year when we started up again. And then within our national windows, we have been given more access, and it's a good thing. And we're going to, broadcast those games like we did last year, which we're still going to. And this is part of the what I alluded to earlier, which is that some of the things that we were forced to adapt to in this world probably will not change as we move forward, if we ever get back to normal again, or whatever the new normal is, of feeding all the cameras back, the 8 to 10 cameras we have on a baseball game and a national window, back to an LA control room and producing and directing it from LA. And those are the things that we embrace and we want to be able to do for our baseball coverage. And it's something that I think the technology has allowed us to move forward with that. And, the latency that we might have experienced maybe 7 or 8 years ago when we first tried to do this is cut down by a heavy amount. And it's not, I'm not going to say it's zero, but it's something that our directors and producers can work with and understand and realize that when they're working with that kind of latency, that they have to, do certain things a little differently, but it's just adapting and understanding that.
Thanks. To that point, the poll question about asking the audience, do you think the shift to distributed production techniques for sports is permanent? 77% said yes. So obviously we either have a very informed audience or they believe.
Yeah, and I want to say on that note, it's I know sometimes it can be viewed as change is abrupt and it's something people have to adapt to. But with that, I think it allows production to think in a different way, and also this world that we live in, which is budgets and cost. It allows you to move your cost, where you might have saved money in one spot to add more equipment in another spot. So that's something that, for example, last season when we had college football, if we wanted to add a couple of cameras, but you also have to add an EVS with it, the cost of adding an EVS in Los Angeles was just a body to add it here in LA, as opposed to traveling in that body and traveling in different people and adding more cost to it. It made it much more tolerable and budget friendly in that world.
Pat mentioned what the world feed approach has meant to him as a truck vendor, and discussed sort of the broader implications for labor in jobs. What I've heard from producers is they would prefer not to have to rely on the world feed because they're used to a certain level of customization. Do you think that change is going to be permanent, that you're not going to go back to the scenario where there's maybe 3 or 4 different trucks at a venue, and how do you manage that from your perspective, creatively, I guess?
I think it depends on the sport, right? It depends on the league that you're dealing with. We have international soccer matches that are world feed dependent solely, right? You don't travel announcers from the US to go to South America, all that often to do tournaments and whatnot, or, to Europe or whatnot. So I think it just depends on what league or property you're dealing with and where that plays in. And yes, creatively, it does put a restriction on you, and it just depends on how much you want to push back. And I realize that, like, in the world of baseball, when there's a home show and an away show, the away show doesn't want to focus on what the home show is doing. And it's up to the league of how much do you want to limit the people on site and how much you want to cater to the broadcasters that are there.
Thanks. Remo, as a graphics vendor, what can Viz do, or maybe has already done to, help out these broadcasters? So, as a viewer at home and you're watching it, it's not immediately apparent to you that you're getting a feed. You're not looking at the same batch of cameras or maybe the same direction that you used to for your, regional sports broadcast, your favorite team.
So one thing that I just want to come back to on the distributed production and sort of the different needs that you have when you are at different places along the chain, right? If you just get kind of the world feed, like Judy said, you're kind of limited on what you can add content-wise, because there is also limits of what you have available to, for instance, add any AR directly into the feed or so. I think that's definitely something that we are focusing on a lot. To, for instance, when we added some of the technology also already last year, that you can kind of analyze the program feed, which camera is on at what moment in time. You can do a sort of analysis on where the camera is looking and so on, and that gives you afterwards creative freedom add content to the different levels as you, or to the different cameras as you want to. Of course, you can cut in other cameras if you are allowed to, and you have the additional material, which is not always the case. But it's sort of those parts to kind of do more stuff also downstream is certainly key. Some parts you can compute before, take this metadata in, and based on that metadata, you can have more flexibility on adding stuff. But then also on the just so one of the polls was kind of looking at what are the preferences of the people watching the feed, and it was extremely distributed. And I think that's where, when it comes to that part, if you have a world feed, you can still create different flavors. I think that's something where in the future we will go, that you basically create different flavors for different regions, for different segments, based on whatever material you have available. We are really focusing on making that easier, that you can just work wherever in the chain you are, and whatever kind of input you have, or pre-cut feed, and that you can enhance and just focus on the story. I mean, we are really focusing on the storytelling in general, our clients and broadcasters can basically focus on the content and enriching that, instead of thinking of where you are in the production chain and where in the distribution part you are.
Thanks. Greg, Judy mentioned that, latency has gotten a lot better, which is enabling, some of these remote workflows to be feasible now in 2020, 2021. And from an operational perspective, they're high quality. What do you see as, what's your take on the relative, production quality of these remote workflows, video quality? And is there anything, you guys just did a huge production, between live and studio stuff at the Super Bowl? Any new lessons that you learned from Tampa that you'd like to share with our audience?
Sure. The quality, so of course, video quality and latency is a trade-off, right? You trade off the ability to have good quality by adding latency. But for the most part, the particular CamStream systems, the quality was quite high. We were able to strike a reasonable balance between the latency and the video quality. So that worked well. And of course, in some of the bigger events like the Super Bowl, where we had basically layer 2 connectivity, the latency there is the IP latency is basically milliseconds. It's very, very small. And so we were able to take advantage of that connectivity at the Super Bowl for our pre-game, post-game, and halftime game shows, which were located in Tampa. They were actually physically on site where the studio operation was. However, we did take advantage of systems that were in New York, particularly EVS and graphics. So we actually had EVS playout, actually record and playout, located in New York, as well as graphics. And we established between Tampa and New York, I think it was roughly 30 or so J2K paths, bidirectional J2K paths, which of course are very low latency. So by doing that, we actually gave the production play out and record capability plus graphics, and we didn't have to have those operators go to Tampa. And so the fact that we use these low latency links allowed production the ability to essentially see those devices as if they were local. And in fact, I liken the broadcast center as being another mobile unit to the production, frankly. And it worked quite well. And as part of that low latency, you think, oh, it's only audio and video, but it's not. There are other pieces to the production. For example, tally. When you take a source, you want tally to essentially be immediate. And in fact, we architected it as such. The other piece was the the TD sitting at the production switcher, when they would take a playout source, they would actually trigger that EVS to play out from Tampa into New York. And again, that had to be low latency and it had to be predictable. So latency plays a big role in multiple places in the production, and it all worked quite well. And in fact, I think the highest compliment that we got is that the producers didn't seem to think that there was much difference between their ability to produce a show with those types of remote facilities.
Thanks. Jerry, just want to ask you a quick question. Obviously, CP deals with a lot of wireless links. Has been doing that, been a big part of their business for years. Are there any considerations there in using wireless camera links as part of a distributed workflow, or is that basically the same? Are there any additional latency concerns?
Well, to the extent that you use microwave, the latency is well understood and it's extremely low. Microwave systems in general, though, tend to be manpower intensive. So what we're finding is more and more people are opting for a bonded cellular solution to replace the microwave. First of all, it's less expensive to deploy because you pay for the bandwidth that you use. You also have a lot more options because in encoders, you can have anywhere from 6 to 8 individual connections at the same time from a single encoder. But there is a latency trade-off there when you start using cellular. Judy and Greg have both mentioned, though, that production teams are learning how to work with this pretty effectively. We're able to get down generally under a second encode to decode with good cellular connections. And by later this year, we should be under 500 mils, so under a half a second, which is at that point, you're rivaling traditional microwave RF type of transmission. And we think that's going to open up an awful lot of new opportunities for producers to go places where you just couldn't have gone before. Because you always needed to be able to see a receive site, or at the very least, it took a receive site.
Right.
This allows decode anywhere in the world that you've got internet access. Now, latency is going to play, if you're going to the other side of the world, yeah, it's going to take, some heartbeats to get there. But the fact is you're able to at very high quality.
Okay, thank you. We just ran a poll question, kind of on a topic I had a story today about, which was formats, and the prospects for UHD and HDR. And the question we asked the audience was, what do you see as a dominant production format 5 years from now? Only 6% thought it was 720p and 1080i. 32% thought it'd be 1080p HDR. 52% thought it'd be 4K HDR, and then there were even 10% of people who thought 8K would be the dominant format. But I guess I'll start with Pat. Are those is that an accurate impression of the market? Do you think they think our audience has it right, that 4K is the most likely to win out 5 years from now? I think Pat's muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I actually, I was thinking about, I think if you had a 3-year horizon, it'd be 1080p HDR. 5-year horizon, 4K HDR. The cost of producing native 4K HDR in the face of the budget constraints that our customers are facing right now, both national and regional, I think, it's going to be at least 5 years before things bounce back enough so that people actually want to take on 4K HDR and the costs inherent in doing such a thing. 1080p HDR is another matter altogether, and we're doing quite a bit of that as it is right now. We did the Super Bowl last year with Fox in 1080p HDR. And that was a really large scale production that I think would have been extremely challenging to do in 4K HDR. Now, we will be doing some CBS work at the Masters in 4K HDR as we have in the past, but that's limited to 4 or 5 holes. So I think the audience intuition is correct on it, but there's a big caveat to that, and that's the whole our whole economic microcosm that our industry is going to have to bounce back significantly from COVID in order for that to actually occur.
And just, for people in the audience who maybe aren't, deep into the technical details of this, what is the biggest challenge of doing 4K for a big event like the Super Bowl, from a technical perspective?
Well, I'll answer that, and then I'll defer to Judy and Greg. Greg has a lot of experience in this. The biggest issue is you can't really do native 4K HDR replay, and I mean you can do it, but instead of having 20 servers for an event like the Super Bowl, or 25 or 40, you'd have to have 140, and that's just not practical. I think that's the biggest impediment and probably the biggest cost swing. I have no idea. It's not really our area of expertise. I have no idea what transmission costs are for 4K HDR, but I would suspect that that's quite expensive as well.
Yeah, Greg, weigh in on what you see as
Sure.
some of the challenges and what makes sense in the near term. I mean, I'd ask Judy, but they obviously already think 1080p HDR makes sense because they've done a fair amount of it.
Pat's right on the money there. I mean, to produce any large scale show in 4K, regardless whether it's HDR or not, is a challenge. There's many things. Legacy content. How do you get legacy content into a 4K show? You of course have to go through a workflow that converts it to that. So there's complications. I think 1080p HDR in the near term is a really sweet spot. I've said that many times. The infrastructure supports it today. Not very difficult to get there. But that said, when you look out at the horizon, one of the impediments to 4K, of course, is you have 4 wires for every source essentially, or if you're doing 12G, I mean you have one, but that in and of itself is a complication. So I think one of the ultimate enablers for a 4K production is IP. Is when things start to when mobile units become natively IP, that I think will be an enabler, more of an enabler to higher bandwidth productions. I think that and when you look out at the horizon as mobile units evolve or they move into their next generation of technology, 5 years could be a very good number.
Okay, thanks. Remo, what's your perspective of ISRT? And I do understand the thinking on this varies internationally too. Where we tend to be very U.S. focused on this, but.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would also say, I mean, first and foremost, HDR. I think HDR is something which brings a lot of quality visually, especially for outdoor sports. It's just brings a lot of perceivable quality. 1080p already is a big step forward, I would say. But when I look at globally, I think 4K, especially also in when we look at soccer or football in Europe, depends on how you want to call it, and then also kind of in Asia, they're also like they're very heavily investing in 4K for the transmission. But I would agree with Greg. I think IP is really the enabler which will make a lot of these things easier. When you think about having 4 cables, I think that's not gonna scale in big time. From a technology provider perspective, from us, it's certainly we basically support 4K HDR, and then it's up to our customers to decide what fits best, either their workflow, their costs. It also depends on which game it is. If you have the Super Bowl, there is a little bit more money around. If you have like a regional sport, there's going to be less. So I think that's certainly going to be driving and having a requirement for different formats. But I think another part which is key that Greg brought up, how do you combine different formats? I think if you want to transmit it over IP even, and just like smoothly combine different formats from previous years, older footage, combine it with the newer captured footage in one production, we are really focusing on making that sort of kind of transparent for the production itself, that you can just have like any kind of feeds. When you look at NDI, which is basically supporting all kinds of formats, even outside of broadcast formats, because more and more you will have unconventional stuff. If you have more digital content, you might even have stuff that has been captured with a phone. Of course, that's not afterwards, not the Super Bowl, but you have different ways of getting impressions in, and I think that's going to be key. How do you mix different formats and then create the output for also different formats, how they're going to be consumed? Because now we're always thinking that, of course, you will consume the 4K HDR on the big screen, but somebody will consume it on the cell phone, somebody will consume it over a social media network, and then it's going to be kind of converted again. But I think the production and also the possibilities that you have, if you have a 4K camera, potentially, even if you take a sub element out of it, it just gives you much more possibilities to compute or zoom in a certain area. I think kind of the ability to do more with more pixels is definitely something that we try to come up with good ideas of what we could provide, and then we let Greg and Judy create like fantastic stuff out of it once they have all the pixels available. But yeah, I think to make it short, I think on a 5-year horizon, I see 4K HDR certainly the format which is going to be pushing forward, especially because IP will allow to just very flexibly combine these formats also with others.
Thanks. Come up near the end of our time. I do want to let Jerry weigh in on this if he has a viewpoint on where he thinks we are. Where do you think we are in 3 years? I guess go to Pat's premise.
Oh, well, getting away from the resolution and number of pixels discussion and thinking more broadly, I think in 3 years, one of the key things that we're going to see is a hybrid cloud production environment that's going to be very standard. I don't think you can use the cloud exclusively just because of latency, and physics is physics. It's going to impose some restrictions. But I think one of the things that's going to happen from companies like Remo's and dozens of others is they're going to start deploying virtual instances of their technology coupled with on-premises compute that's going to give people the ability to extend production power by orders of magnitude using a hybrid cloud environment in a truck, in a studio, all these things, to be able to leverage an Amazon data center to provide you with graphics, switching, mixing, replay, all of these things, stuff we haven't thought of yet, AR, VR, as part of the regular production. I think in 3 years, we're going to see at least the leaders are going to be doing this. And I think that within 5, it's going to move downstream to sort of be very commonplace to be leveraging those kind of technologies. And 4K is going to play a role in it. As Remo said, once you're IP, that whole equation just gets a whole lot simpler. Doing all of that does.
I think one thing that we didn't mention here, but it's kind of AI. So if you want to compute stuff out of the images, Pat was mentioning, like you can do kind of certain things automatic on kind of lower leagues. You could basically put the camera there. You can compute more out of it because there is just more information in the image, which will allow you to do certain things more automated. So I think that's not going to be necessarily like 2 to 3 years, but it's rather going to be 5 years. But I definitely see that going to have a big impact on production.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we've gone past our time. Obviously, we had a lot to talk about, and I really appreciate all my panelists' insights, and thanks to audience members too. We had a lot of questions come in. I think I answered a lot of them, so it was why I didn't go to an hour. Panelists are very forthcoming on the challenges they're dealing with. So I hope it's been informative for everyone, and I wish everyone a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks very much for joining the webinar today. Follow TV News Check on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn for more information about upcoming events. And we'll have a story about this webinar next week on TV News Check, and you'll get a link to the video in an email in about an hour. Thanks a lot.